What's going on, everyone? Today we'll be doing Java prototype pattern. So we'll talk about what it is, why we want to use it, how we can use it, and then some tips for memorizing this pattern. Okay, so what is the prototype pattern? Again, this is a creational pattern, so there's different categories of patterns, right? So this one falls under the creational pattern. So it's for creating objects in Java. So instead of creating an object from scratch, we create a clone instead. So that's what this pattern is all about, okay? So let's talk about why we'd want to do that. So why would we want to create a clone instead of using the new operator? So sometimes construction of an object is expensive. For instance, maybe an object requires a connection to a database. You need a bunch of information from the database, and you want to maybe save that state in an object in your application. And what if you need to create another object from that? And maybe the state hasn't changed, so maybe I'll just create a clone of it instead. And then when we make clones as well, we have the flexibility of changing just a few fields on an object, so that's a good use case as well. What if an object has 10 fields and we just need to change 2 of them for a new object? Instead of creating new and setting all of the different setters on the object, what if we can just clone it and just modify 2 of the fields that we need? And then third here, when an object is similar, it's easier to clone them than constructing them from scratch. Okay, so how do we make a clone in Java? So Java actually supports out of the box on the object class, the very highest inheritance tree, right? The very top object in Java is Java object, and it supports it has a .clone method. To use this clone method, though, you need to implement the java.lang.clonable interface. And this is just a marker interface. So what's a marker interface? It's just a interface that the compiler can look at, and it actually doesn't have any methods. It's just basically tagging the object to say that it is allowed to clone, to make it clonable. And then there's this concept of shallow copy versus deep copy. So by default, Java's out-of-the-box.clone method is a shallow copy implementation. What is a shallow copy? All right, so let's look at an example for that. Okay, so here we are with the simple person model example here. So I've implemented the clonable interface, and if I do a .clone with this object, right? So if I initialize this somewhere and I want to clone this object, then a shallow copy is sufficient here. Why? Because all of these are simple types. So they will be initialized, or they will be copied directly over. However, if I go over to this complex person class, I've implemented clonable. I have these 3 same simple fields, right? However, I have objects in here. So in this case, if I do .clone for the complex person model, it will not initialize a new address for me. It'll use the original address that's on the previous object. So if any changes happen to this address on the previous one or this new clone, they both point to the same object in memory. So that's an issue, right? So they're kind of connected. They have a dependency. We don't want any dependencies, right? We want to create a new object without using new. We want to clone it and have them be 2 separate objects. So in this case, we need to implement our own clone method for like address and job, etc. Okay, and that would be a deep copy right there. Okay, so that's something to be aware of. Okay, so how can we memorize the prototype pattern? So we can remember that we want to clone objects. So think of a prototype. We want to clone that prototype. So I have a picture here of a car, right? So a lot of times in the car industry, they'll create like concepts of cars. And once they get to a good spot in their drawing board, then they'll probably clone that car, right? So that's maybe an efficient way of doing it. So maybe that's one way it could stick in your mind. So you create a prototype car. Okay, instead of creating that car from scratch every time, I just want to copy it because it's more efficient or it's faster. So think of like the copy and paste example here as well. When you have a big chunk of text, are you going to write it by hand by looking at it? If you need to copy it somewhere else, if you need to put it in another document, no, you're going to copy and paste it, right? So that's the same thing with the prototype pattern. We want to copy it and put it somewhere else or create a new object out of it. So that's the prototype pattern. And then, yeah, just remember here that dot clone is only a shallow copy. So if you have a simple object, the shallow copy is fine. However, if you need a deep copy, then you'll need to implement your own clone method or override the clone method and create your own implementation for the clone. Awesome. Well, thanks a lot. I hope that made sense. Please like or subscribe. I'll continue posting videos on software engineering and leadership. Thanks a lot.